Welcome back, everyone. Our final breakout of the day and of the GRC Summit is on AI insights and efficiencies in Viacom's social campaigns. Our speaker today is Matthew Moocarme. He's a director and senior data scientist at Viacom's advertising science team. As a part of his role, Matthew determines and predicts all aspects and success of Viacom's brand ad campaigns, from data aggregation to data integrity to predictive modeling and forecasting. So with that, I'd like to welcome Matthew on stage.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I've actually changed up my title just a little bit, and I've related it to around GDPR and how it's going to impact AI. And I've used Viacom as a specific case study. And so the outline of my talk is going to be as follows. First, I'm going to give a brief introduction onto kind of what GDPR is and how it relates to AI. And then I'm going to go over exactly how technical companies have changed a lot of their the way that they present their data in response to GDPR. And then I'm going to use Viacom as a case study. So what have we done personally at Viacom to kind of be GDPR compliant, and how has that affected the way that we use AI now at Viacom? Then I'm going to give some takeaways onto, if you're working with AI, if you're working with data scientists or data engineers, what can you do in order to make sure that you are GDPR compliant? Even though it went into effect just a couple of weeks ago, it hasn't affected the US just as yet, but I think it will come in the future. And then finally, I'm going to make a brief conclusion. So what is GDPR? I think we all kind of know, especially at this conference. But basically, it's a set of regulations that was designed to give an elevated level of protection around EU customers regarding their data and how companies use the data. So it was first proposed in early 2012. It was kind of formally approved in 2016, and it just went into effect just a couple of weeks ago. It's really meant to supersede national laws around EU customers only, and it's really meant to unify a lot of the data protection. It applies to all organizations that have EU customers, and there will be significant penalties for companies that breach the regulations. I think it's around 20 million euros or 4% of the global revenue, whichever is greater. So if you think about a company like Amazon or something that has billions of dollars in revenue, this is going to be a huge impact for them because they obviously have customers in the EU. Some of the key driving points for GDPR was really to kind of update a lot of the measures that went into effect in 1995. And it's easy to think of why we need to update this. If you think about how much technology has changed in the last 23 years, it's been phenomenal growth. The computer that I had in 1995 is kind of piddles compared to the computer that I have in my pocket right now, right? So no one could have really predicted the growth, and so it's not easy to reason why we need to update these principles. And it's really meant to modernize that directive. It also goes to set the individual rights for EU customers and really elevate those standards and provide a high level of explicit consent for those customers. Moreover, it's going to establish methods for ensuring the compliance for companies. And again, it is only for EU customers. And so we've gone over GDPR, and I wanted to go over it briefly, just in case there are some members of the audience that are a little bit unfamiliar with it. Next, I'm going to go over what is AI. So it's easy to do a quick Google search and figure out what AI is. And if you go to the first link, you'll get to the 2001 hit classic by Steven Spielberg featuring Jude Law. But that's actually not quite what we're going to be talking about, although it is of the same concept. moreover, AI stands for artificial intelligence, and it is really when machines exhibit what we consider to be kind of intelligence. It's when they kind of perceive their environment and they can make decisions for themselves regarding how to maximize some goal or to minimize some loss function. So maximizing goal might be, you could say, like increasing profit or reducing the kind of churn rate of your customers on your website. And so you can design models around this that will kind of achieve this goal. And it's really the science of training systems to perform kind of human tasks in a way that is useful to us. And so to make things a little bit more clearer, I noticed that a lot of people use the term AI in this really broad sense. And so I'd like to clarify it a little bit more. Because as a data scientist, it does kind of bother me just a little bit when people talk about AI in the wrong sense. And so just to clarify, artificial intelligence is this broad scope of kind of machines doing useful tasks. And this could be, for instance, using Excel. This is a fundamental use of AI because it's making us more efficient. It's calculating tasks that we can do or would take us a very long time to do. So it's going from Microsoft Excel all the way up to your deep learning tasks such as classification of images, like you would see in Amazon AWS and autonomous cars. So that's what AI is. It's this really big, broad, encompassing kind of measure of machines doing smart tasks. And then there's also machine learning. And so machine learning is more of kind of what I do, in fact, and it's that use case of AI. It's making it useful. It's those algorithms that we use in order to kind of decrease some loss function. And so this is what you might see as kind of the algorithmic. Well, this is what papers write about. They're doing machine learning algorithms. And then there's deep learning. And deep learning is a family of machine learning algorithms that we read about mostly in the news. And so this is deep learning algorithms are neural networks that have many layers, which make them deep. And they're used for usually classification tasks, such as identifying objects on the road, if you're using it for like autonomous vehicles, or they even use it for like facial recognition. So if you read anything like that in the news, then this is what they're referring to. They're talking about a class of artificial intelligence referred to as deep learning. And it's these deep learning algorithms that they're training. And so as a data scientist, I kind of branch all three of those. Plus there's another circle regarding like that business use case. And how does any of this rely on making Viacom more money? And so so I span all three of those, and I create deep learning models as well as machine learning, but I tell everyone it's just AI because I can't be bothered to go through this every single time. And so what can AI do? Well, basically it can only learn from the data that it's been trained on. And so this is really, really fundamental. If you train a deep learning model on how to classify the different breeds of dogs, and then you send it in a cat, it's going to think it's some weird type of dog. And so this is a really important concept to know, because you can't expect some sort of AI model to figure out something that it has never seen before. But it can pick up a lot of the nuances and patterns in various data sets that can make it incredibly useful. Patterns that we can't see ourselves. And so an example, going back to the classification of dog breeds, you can train a deep learning model on, say, 10,000 images of various dogs that are labeled with 100 different classes or breeds of dog, and it can figure it out pretty easily with 99.9% accuracy. But a human could never do that. You'd be able to get onto about maybe 95% with the top dog breeders. And so it can really pick up these nuances and patterns in the various data sets that you feed it. And what I like to use it for is doing lots of the boring work. And so I hate manual entry. I can't stand it. And I hate when anyone else in my team does it. And so I try and automate a lot of these boring tasks. And so AI models can easily do that, and I think that's what they're great for. And they can make better, as in more accurate, more consistent decisions that are objective compared to a human. They're also incredibly efficient. So you can classify lots of different things in seconds that might take a human an incredibly long time to do. So again, they extract insights from the data that they're presented. And they take into consideration, they can't take into account considerations outside of the data that they're given, again. But the more data you give them, the better they become. And so they can figure out these minute and nuanced patterns, such as in speech patterns. So we all have virtual assistants on our phones now, and the more training examples of speech that we give them, such as whenever you talk to your Amazon Echo, it could be capturing that and using it to make Alexa sound a little bit more human-like in the future. Also for visual patterns, it's used a lot for training autonomous vehicles. They have images of people on the road. The more images you give it of someone walking by in front of the car, the more it's going to recognize that that is an object which we should absolutely avoid. And so the more data you give it, the better it can become in recognizing those patterns. And also, if you're predicting the kind of customer patterns for consumer or retail use, you can give it better understanding on how to detect fraud. And so how does Viacom use AI? I've shown a number of different examples. One way is we use it to optimize our social campaigns. And so we post a lot of different posts on our Facebook handles, such as MTV. And we need to understand exactly how well they're going to perform. And so we have really sophisticated models that can tell really precisely how well it will do by kind of the end of our campaign, which is usually in about 2 weeks. We also use it to kind of measure the emotionality of our fans online. So for an example, on Facebook, people comment a lot on our posts. And we want to understand how are they resonating with our content. Do they like it? Do they hate it? Do they find it abhorrent? And so we have state-of-the-art natural language processing models that we train kind of every week in order to figure out how well they're doing. And that does take a little bit of subjectivity, but we have kind of hit that stride where we're now getting in the data and feeding it into the latest models, and now we can begin to figure out, and we'll give it to an analyst, and they'll say, okay, around this social campaign, this is how our audience was reacting, and then we can hand that to our client advertisers, and they really seem to like that. And we also use it to kind of create sales projections. So Viacom is a media company. We sell advertisements on our channels, but we really need to know how many people are going to be watching those television channels, so we can figure out how we're going to price them out to price out those advertisements. And so we're now creating these projections that would usually take an analyst a whole day, and which can be done in minutes. So this has really increased our efficiency, and it's kind of our team's goal to automate and innovate. Those are our two key drivers. And so that's kind of what GDPR is and what AI is. So how do they relate to each other? Well, GDPR governs the protection of data for EU customers, and AI needs data to train on. So it's really the fundamental data source that links the two. And if we think about AI systems and me as a data scientist, I saw GDPR and I was like, oh God, this is going to be terrible. So the first thing I did was, I panicked, because now I'm going to have to, involve all these extra things in order to make my AI systems comply with GDPR. But then I listened to Marvin, and his motto was not panic. It was, in fact, don't panic. And so I kind of took an objective look at what I had, all the data I had, and then kind of figured out what we needed to do. Because in the end, GDPR is a good thing. If we look at 2017, it was a record-breaking year for data breaches, as we heard just in the last talk. Cambridge Analytica, Equifax, Alteryx, These are a huge number. These are hugely significant in terms of how much data was lost and how much was breached. And in fact, over 2.6 billion records were breached with over 1,700 separate incidents. And GDPR isn't going to be the one save-all to combat this, but it is going to help. In terms of data breaches, there are obligations that organizations that they have to report those breaches within 72 hours, so that's obviously a good thing. And failure to comply will result in, again, significant penalties. But what will change? It's not all going to be a good thing. Although it's clearly good for the consumer, some have called GDPR the AI killer. And while that moniker is just a tad bit extreme, it does kind of ask a few questions that why is it the AI killer? And so I'm going to go into what I think are two main reasons to why people think that GDPR will hamper the innovation of AI. And the first of those is that data collection will be much, much harder. First of all, for the reasons that there'll have to be explicit consent from the customer. And so that's necessarily going to reduce the amount of data that you have, because not everyone is going to consent to their data being used in the way that you want it to be used, even if it is for their benefit. And the second reason is that data cannot be kept indefinitely. So there has to be you have to use the data for a set kind of time period. And so that when we talk about AI models and AI systems, we want to train it on as much data as possible so that we can pick out those nuances and patterns in the data. And sometimes that takes years of data because you want to look at seasonal trends and what if some incident happened in 5 years ago that you want to look at and that affected your data set in some way. And so by having this time bound, as well as the number of kind of data points that might be missing because not everyone gave consent, you're going to reduce the amount of data. It's going to make it much harder. And so your models might not be as accurate because of that reason. And so there are companies that just indiscriminately collect all this data, for example, like clickstreams and such, and it could really hamper their effort because now they're held accountable for that data they've already collected. And so if they've built their company around collecting all this data and using it and making models around it, which I have seen myself with third-party vendors that we use, it's really affected them in a negative way because now they're held compliant to all that data and they really have to pivot their model. The second reason why GDPR might impact AI is that GDPR requires the manual review of algorithmic decisions. So what does that even mean? So that means if a decision has been made by some model, then it has to go through this human layer, this human in the loop, before anything gets acted on. And so this could be an even disincentive for companies to use AI in the first place. Because how do you even do that? It can be really complicated to kind of put this human in the loop when you've designed everything around not having a human in the loop to be objective as possible. And it may give a competitive advantage to those working outside the EU. So if you have a company, say, in Asia, and you're working in America, maybe you could just look at that company in Asia to make all your models rather than look to a company in the EU. And this human involvement demands a lot of effort in order to put in place in the first place. So it could really be a disincentive. And so the way I see it, there are kind of three key questions that a company that's using AI would need to answer in order to kind of make sure that this will solve like 90% of their issues. The first is how can consent be managed within AI models? The second being, is it possible to find profiling details? This is your PII, your personally identifiable information. Does any of that exist within any of your models? And the third is, how do you involve humans in AI systems when the real nature of AI is to kind of get rid of humans, or at least to take some of their workload off the humans, automate a lot of the boring work. And so I'm going to answer a few of those three questions using this case study with Viacom and what I've done personally in order to kind of make sure that we are compliant with GDPR and, in the end, give you guys some takeaways onto what you can do as well if you are using them. So who is Viacom and what authority do we have on any of this? Well, Viacom is a collection of premium networks and brands that span across all the demographics, all the way from Nickelodeon and Nick Jr., which are our youngest audience, all the way up to TV Land, which are our more mature audience. And so we have touch points in kind of three main areas. We have television, we have digital, so that's your Hulu and your Netflix. And we also have social. So social is like Facebook and YouTube and Instagram. And I'm going to talk to you today about, I'm just going to take a subset of that and look at just social because that's what I'm most familiar with. And also it's, I think, most impactful and what people have seen most about in the news. And so to answer this first question, how can consent be managed within AI? And so first of all, in order to answer that, we need to see where does Viacom use data and how do we get data. And so we get data from a number of different third-party sources. If you look at television ratings, we get it from Nielsen. If you look at our digital, we might get it from Hulu or something, or Adobe. And for social, we get it directly from the platforms themselves or from third-party social listening companies. And so those are kind of the main sources that we get it. And then we have to ask the question, is it first-party or third-party? So what is first-party and third-party? First-party is when we get the data ourselves. For example, we have a kids app called Noggin. It's developed by Nickelodeon. And so in that case, we built the app, so we collect the data ourselves. And because we are collecting the data, in order to make sure that Viacom is GDPR compliant, we have to adhere to the rules ourselves. But because it's Nickelodeon and there are strict rules governing how you collect data around kids, known as COPA, we, in fact, were already GDPR compliant on that end. And then the second part is, or the second way we get data is through third party. And necessarily, if those third party companies, such as the platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram, if they are GDPR compliant and the data that they give us is, then necessarily we will be as well. But we also get it from third party social listening sources, and something that we've noticed is that they have been hit incredibly hard. And this is because those platforms have reduced the amount of public data available such that they can't do their job as well, and so their business has been impacted. And so if you look at those social data sources, most of them are already compliant, which is great for us, because that means we don't have to do anything. We just have to kind of change the features into our models, because now we might be missing some columns because they're not giving us everything, which is fine. But because they are, we don't have to do as much work. They have also limited the amount of public access or public data available. So an example of this is Instagram recently deprecated their old API in which they you could do like hashtag searches and see what kind of posts were on a specific hashtag. And social listening companies would use this to do some sort of competitive analysis. So they would compare hashtag MTV to, say, our competitor, hashtag refinery29, let's say. And then they would compare kind of how many hashtags were used. And because the social platforms have limited that data, now it's put them at a disadvantage. But it also gives us an opportunity as well. So it's not all bad. With those social platforms, there's active opt-ins, which is that explicit consent that we talked about earlier. And because they handle it, we don't have to handle it ourselves. it's all within their privacy concerns. So there's explicit privacy notices by those social platforms. And because it's in there for the social platforms, we don't have to deal with it, which is, again, great for us. And the last point is that those social listening services that we used to use, because they're not able to actively get the data and provide it to us, it's provided us an opportunity, because now our first-party data, the data that we get ourselves, becomes much more valuable. So it, in fact, becomes an opportunity to us. And so we're working hard in order to see if we can eliminate as many third-party sources as possible, such that we have the most control over our own data. And so we can tick off that box. We can answer that question. How can consent be managed? Well, it depends on our data sources, and because the social platforms themselves are handling that aspect, they're passing the savings on to us. And so now we answer the next question. Is it possible to find profiling details, such as PII, within our AI systems? And again, that turns to look into the data that we're training the models on. And so it turns out that because we're using this third-party data from the platforms themselves, such as Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, because the data that they give us is anonymized, they might give us an ID. Sometimes it will come with a name, if it's a comment, but in fact we don't even use it because we don't need it. And this ID that they give us it can't be matched to any other system of record. And so it's just, for us, a number that is only useful within our own data. So ID 999 only means anything in our data set. If we try and look up ID 999 online anywhere else, it won't mean anything. So that makes my life easier. I don't need to know any of that, so I'm all for it. Another way that we can identify PII is we've used this tool called AWS Macy. So we're an AWS shop. We use it extensively. Excuse me. And it can go through all your records. So we keep everything in S3 buckets. Think of it like a Dropbox. And it can go through and see if there's any PII in there. And moreover, it can tell you who's been using it, who's been accessing it. And so it's a great way to, first of all, identify if there is any PII in there. Thankfully, there isn't any for us. So we can just run it and then disregard it. But if there was, we could keep it tracked on there and then see who was using it and accessing it, which is great to figure out, for security purposes, who's been accessing our data, especially when there is PII, because of course it is incredibly sensitive. So then we can tick that box off. We know that we don't have any PII in there, so we don't need to worry. Our AI models won't pass that PII through, and we don't need it. So now we get on to the last question. How do we involve humans in the loop when AI models try and take the workload out of humans? Well, what we do at Viacom is we develop our data products we give them a front end in which humans have to use it, such that our AI models can even do anything. And so we provide a front end interface. And so this could be just a user login, and then this is what the model outputted. Do you want to act on it, essentially? And then they might approve it, and then the model will go into effect. And so this includes user login, so we can tell exactly who is using the product and the system, but also a changelog, so we can figure out. An example is for our social campaigns. So, we schedule a lot of our posts onto our social channels, and then we also have predictive models that will figure out exactly how well they will do, because we might need to know if we need to put any paid spend behind them. And so that's what the models are figuring out, how much paid spend needs to be put behind them, if at all. Maybe we need to put in another post. And that we package that up, and then we put it into a front end in which a user will log in and then approve it. And because it has a changelog in there, we can figure out and if we needed to do any audits or anything, this is something that we could use to figure out how, who was using it and when and why. And it also just provides a high level of authority. One thing that I found useful as a data scientist in order for people to actually trust my models that I'm building is to give them the final approval. Say, this is what my model says, and you can take it into account. You are the subject matter expert. And one thing that I found is to be incredibly helpful is to have that front end and see, this is what the model predicts. Do you want to act on it, yes or no? And then time will go on, and because we're tracking the performance of, in this case, these social posts, the model will say, like, this is what I predicted, and usually it will follow closely along to how it actually performs. So this way you can build up trust in your models, which is incredibly helpful for adoption of your models. And this was an unintended purpose, being GDPR compliant, but it's something that's incredibly helpful. And if you have the time to invest, then I would highly recommend packaging your models into a front end if you need to. And so that way we can answer that final question. By making a front-end interface, we can give humans that last decision-making process, so they can either choose to use the model or not. And so there's, in fact, other steps that we've taken in order to make sure that we are GDPR compliant. One is we actually hired a GDPR expert. One new thing that we're doing is we're creating a digital studios, so we're going to be creating a lot of the content in-house and then posting it digitally via an app. And so now we're going to get a lot more first-party data. And because we're getting a lot more first-party data, we have to make sure that we're more compliant, and there are extra steps that we need to take in order to make sure that we are compliant. And so one thing we did was hire an expert to do that. Another way is we kind of engage in a cross-functional, company-wide effort to make sure that we are compliant. So I work in a research team that acts kind of like a startup within Viacom. And we are very independent. We have our own AWS account. And so it really takes a lot, and we're not the only team like that. And so it really takes a company-wide effort to make sure that we're all on the same page. And so there's been a lot of emails, workshops that have gone out in order to make sure that we are all on the same page. And things like using AWS Macy was one of the things that was covered in a workshop. And so why do we even need to do this? I mean, Viacom is a US company. Well, one reason is that it's now table stakes for any advertiser. So we sell adverts, right? And a lot of our clients are global companies. And so they want to make sure that anything that we do is a reflection on them. And so in that way, it becomes table stakes in order to do any business with global clients, which 90% of companies now are. It also provides a really clear narrative on where we stand as a company. And so because we are GDPR compliant, it shows that we are transparent in our data attributes. Also, it allows us to gathering the first-party data ourselves. It gives us an opportunity to act on that and kind of fill in the voids that maybe some social media listening companies, in my example, were doing. It makes our first-party data a little bit more valuable because of that. And so that leads us to some takeaways for any companies that are working with AI. And I've taken a look back on the steps that I've taken as a data scientist and figured out what could be some takeaways for anyone here working with AI. And the first and most important thing that I thought was to conduct a data audit. This was to figure out what data you're using, what data you're collecting, how you're using it, and in this way, you can really kind of gather an understanding on what you're really using. We've come out of an era of mindlessly collecting data as often and as much as possible. Because storage was cheap. But now we're going to be held accountable for that data that we've collected. And so I think it's become incredibly important to even just to understand what we are collecting. And also not just to understand, but to document it as well. By having so much, we have terabytes and terabytes of data, most of it we don't use as effectively as we should be. And why is that? Because we don't have kind of the staff in order to do it. You need data engineers and data scientists to go through reams and reams of data, terabytes of data, to process it efficiently. And so to document exactly what you have and where is also incredibly important. And what we've done as well is considered a data minimization approach. So sure, we were collecting, click streams on our websites from 2001, but are we really using that anymore? Not really. So what if we just deleted it? I kind of think of our S3 account for AWS as kind of like in my mind. And the more things I have in there, the more buckets I have, the more it's taking up my attention. And my attention is the most valuable thing I have. And so the more I can delete and that I don't need, or I can put it somewhere else, the better. Because not only because I'm going to be held accountable, but it makes my life easier as well. Because now I don't have to search through as many S3 buckets, let's say, in order to get what I need. Also, to communicate your privacy information. Review your company's privacy information. It's going to become incredibly important, not just to look transparent, but to actually be transparent. It serves to kind of let your users of your information know exactly who you are, where you stand, and how you intend to use their data. If you didn't know, what you need to explain is your legal basis of processing the data, as well as your retention period, or how long you're going to keep that data for. And it gives individuals, lets them know where to complain if they need to. Also to review your consent and rights. So GDPR has really been kind of a front runner of letting individuals, giving them the knowledge to have the consent of if companies should use their data or not. And so they should review and record their consent and just review it when possible, because it might come into effect in the short term. But it should also be a positive indication, and it should not be inferred. An example is if you sign up for kind of some website, they will automatically sign you up to some mailing list. And so that can't be done anymore if you're using EU customers. They shouldn't be inferred, it should be a positive. They should click a checkbox that says, yes, sign me up to this mailing list. And an audit trail is also necessary. To review the rights for the customer as well. So people now have kind of enhanced rights through GDPR. And so this includes the right to be forgotten, so there should be systems in place such that if some user wants to be deleted from the system entirely, they have a way to do that. As well as demands a check of procedures and processes for data to ensure that the terms can be met. So this is really putting systems in place that if someone wants to be forgotten, then it can be done so pretty easily, and to actually show that. Other actions that you can take, at least from my learnings, is if your company is big enough, hire a data protection officer. This is someone that is an expert on can bridge that data and legal aspect, which there aren't too many people doing because it's incredibly complicated and it's really, really new. If you work with children's data, we do at Nickelodeon. So we've kind of have known about this for a little bit of a while, but there are enhanced levels that GDPR has gone through in order to kind of protect children's data. And we have a similar thing here in the US. It's called COPA, and it's something that we are incredibly stringent towards. For example, you can't track any children's data under, I think, 13 years old. So that's something we don't even just touch. And so it's something else to keep in mind. And then if you're working with AI models, then consider any inputs that you have. So this is your PII. If you have zip code and then like first name and last name in there, like you probably don't need to have both of them in some sort of predictive model. You can change first and last name to some sort of anonymized ID, let's say. And then one thing that we've actively taken on is to encrypt databases and data stores. At least with AWS, it's incredibly easy. It's more like a click of a button, and then you might have to transfer one S3 bucket to another, and it will just encrypt it on the fly. And so you can do that at store, or you can do it in transit using SSL. So in conclusion, GDPR has gone into effect, and kind of compliance has begun. It's been incredibly scary for me to kind of tackle all the problems that we've had to go through, but I've kind of summarized it into a few points. It may impact the innovation through harder data collection plus the manual review of algorithmic decisions, but that can all be mitigated, one, through having a front end to kind of do the human review process, as well as just doing a simple data audit. We'll figure out if you have any PII in there. Viacom is GDPR compliant, and we have audited our data sources and kind of reduced our dependency on a lot of third-party vendors, which has been, in fact, kind of a boon for us, because now it gives us a lot more power than we thought we had before. We incorporate AI models into our data products in order to satisfy that human review process. And conducting a data audit as well has been incredibly beneficial to not just us and our team, but I think it should be like one key takeaway. If you get anything from this talk, then I would suggest conducting a data audit to figure out what your data has and consider a data minimization approach. Because just because you have a lot of data, it doesn't mean that you can derive as much insights as someone that has 1% as much data. So with that, I'd like to thank you.